To get us started, I'd like to introduce one of IBEC's co-chairs and former CEO of Corn Products International, Mr. Sam Scott. And let me go ahead and unmute him. Go ahead, Mr. Scott. Sam, you have to unmute yourself.
We're good?
Perfect.
Thanks. Good morning. I am co-chair of ABIC, as James said, and the Illinois Business Immigration Coalition is the founding chapter of the American Business Immigration Coalition. We formed the American Business Immigration Coalition about 3 years ago, and ABIC has since that point in time added chapters in Texas, Florida, and North Carolina. We have business relationships in Wisconsin and Colorado, and we're working on new operations now in Arizona and Utah. And we will keep expanding as long as we can make progress that we think we're making so far in this effort. Our mission is a federal immigration reform that expands high and low skilled visas, agricultural visas, and creates a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented, starting with our dreamers. Our coalition is bipartisan, consisting of business leaders, CEOs, retired CEOs, members of chambers of commerce, and advocates. Here in Illinois, we have 127 members from the agricultural community to hospitals to manufacturing, representing over 3,200 businesses and over 43,000 jobs in Illinois. During the pandemic, our team assisted 237 minority-owned businesses and growers with approximately $17 million in PPP loans, saving over 5,000 jobs with an average loan of about $72,000. Now our priorities are a few. One, to extend PPP, simplify the forgiveness process, and direct payments for independent contractors. To ensure the mixed status families, those families with a US citizen married to an undocumented immigrant that have been left out of the pay stimulus check program, are included in the next program. And lastly, immigration reform in 2021. Now I'll turn it over to Rebecca Shee to give some further comments. Rebecca?
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Scott. And it is my pleasure to introduce the co-host for our webinar today, our town hall with Congressman Quigley, Sam Toia. Mr. Toia is the president and CEO of the Illinois Restaurant Association, IBIC board member, and a relentless fighter for independent restaurants, small businesses, and immigrants. While some business leaders may hide, Sam Toia takes on difficult fights and win for the little people. Driver's licenses, inclusive PPP for moms and pops, immigration reform. Not possible without Mr. Toia's leadership. Please help me welcome Sam Toia to share his insights and introduce our congressman and our keynote speaker today. Mr. Toia?
Thank you, Becca, but it's all about teamwork, and we couldn't do all the things we do without the partnership between the Illinois Restaurant Association and IBEC. So thank you, and thank you for your leadership. Again, I'm Sam Toia with the Illinois Restaurant Association. And on behalf of the IRA, we thank everyone here on the Zoom for joining our call, and we greatly appreciate Congressman Quigley for taking the time to speak with us. Before the COVID-19 crisis, the IRA represented the largest private sector employer here in the state of Illinois, with over 594,000 people working in the restaurant food service industry and over 25,000 eating and drinking establishments across the state. As we all know, the restaurant and hospitality industry has been absolutely devastated by the coronavirus. Restaurants were the first ones to close, and in all likelihood will be the last industry to reopen and recover. In Illinois right now, sales are down at restaurants anywhere from 50 to 70% over last year. 86% of restaurant operators say it's unlikely that their restaurants will be profitable within the next 6 months. So 86% of restaurants will not make a profit for 2020. 98% of all Illinois restaurant operators say they have laid off or furloughed team members. Based on these results, we estimate that 321,000 restaurant employees in Illinois were laid off or furloughed at the height of the pandemic, and nearly 80,000 industry workers remain unemployed. Sadly, we estimate at least 20% of the restaurants will not reopen here in the state of Illinois. That will be over 5,000 restaurants. Restaurants operate at an extremely low profit margin, so their business models were never designed for 25 or 50% capacity. On average, 95 to 97 cents of every dollar taken in at restaurants go out for labor cost, product cost, fixed costs. So, you know, it's tough to run restaurants even in normal times, let alone during this pandemic. So every penny counts, every penny counts. And we greatly appreciate Congressman Quigley's support of our industry and the passage of the Paycheck Protection Program, which gave many restaurants a lifeline earlier this year. However, more federal help is needed in order for restaurants to survive now and thrive in the future. We are asking that PPP loan forgiveness be better denied, streamlined, and expand to include more flexibility for small businesses. The IRA and the National Restaurant Association are also calling on Congress to pass the Blueprint for Restaurant Revival, which is a set of short, medium, and long-term measures to support our nation's restaurant and bars and millions of people they employ. As I mentioned earlier, we are the largest private sector employer in the state of Illinois, and we are the second largest private sector employer throughout the country. In this plan, it would include a $120 billion restaurant recovery fund for structural relief to help restaurants get the cash flow they need to adapt, rehire, and eventually reopen. The plan also includes an expansion of the PPP program, making PPP loans tax deductible, improving the employee retention tax credit, and economic injury disaster loans, addressing business interruption insurance, providing customer and employee wellness tax credits, and much more. Additionally, there are 1.7 million US citizens who do not receive a $1,200 stimulus payment because their spouse provided an ITIN on their joint taxes. The IRA and IBEC strongly support the American Citizen Coronavirus Relief Act, a bill introduced by Senator Marco Rubio that aims to eliminate the GOP marriage penalty on mixed status families. All of these measures of support from the federal government are necessary to support American restaurants, which are the nation's, as I mentioned, second largest private sector employer. Now I'd like to introduce Congressman Mike Quigley. I've known the congressman since I was a teenager, and we ain't too far apart in age, so that's a long time, going back to the 80s. The congressman is someone who is always a champion on issues of importance to the restaurant industry, on pragmatic immigration reforms, and more. He's an accessible and open-minded person that is interested in getting things done in Washington, D.C. He's always eager to bring people together, that's his trademark, and to help make things happen. Congressman Quigley, thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to the conversation we're going to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate it. Sam, my good friend for a long time. Appreciate the hard work you're doing. To our friends in the restaurant industry, I'm sorry you're going through what you're going through. Our job is to help you any way we possibly can. I also want to thank the advocates that are on this call. We're in DC a lot, and you're in the trenches every day helping people, and that means a lot to us. And to our immigrant friends, often on the front lines and disproportionately impacted by the virus, grossly unfair situation in which you're doing so much to help us. At the same time, you're not eligible for all the benefits that you should be entitled to. And obviously we want that to change. We can't beat this virus without you. The other thing I want to say is that this is a healthcare crisis that is creating the economic crisis. I know that seems obvious, but there are those who are policymakers who get it reversed. We are never going to be able to help everyone and to turn the economy around until we get the virus under control. And that's taking it seriously, wearing masks, not calling it a hoax, putting in place the Defense Production Act. The original CARES Act had $150 billion for healthcare providers. The HEROES Act that we passed almost 4 months ago had another 75, a lot of it for testing and treatment and tracing and PPE. Those are all things that are going to be absolutely critical. And to address it. And as we stated, this is disproportionately impacting not just the immigrant community, but people of color. And that's all the more reason that we need to get this under control. Sam, you have mentioned the Paycheck Protection Program. We did pass one amendment to this, the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act, that extended the loan period to 24 weeks and decreased the payroll, non-payroll expense to 60/40. The original plan was put together in 9 days, folks. And for a federal program, anything put together in 9 days is A, a miracle, and B, going to have mistakes and problems. We are aware of those, and that's why that was passed. But there were additional changes put in place by the HEROES Act. It helped industries like yours by allowing businesses to take advantage of both PPP and the Employee Retention Tax Credit. And it would have clarified, as Sam mentioned, that PPP expenses that were forgiven are also tax deductible. We recognize that more needs to happen. That's why calls like this are so important. But I will also say we've got two tracks going on at the same time, folks. One is funding the government, which we have to do so we don't shut down. At the same time, we're trying to pass another COVID relief package. Again, we passed ours over 4 months ago. We desperately need Mitch McConnell to step forward and bring a bill to the floor, which is more like that. So I imagine what you're going to see is the Senate passing something that gives far less aid and funds the government through a continuing resolution through December. Never bet against this administration punting the issue until a later time, and we'll see. And again, some of these other measures, we did co-sponsor the Restaurants Act, which would create a fund that would provide direct assistance to grants to certain restaurants. I'm hearing loud and clear from a lot of small businesses, including restaurants, that they don't need more debt. That's not the help. They need direct assistance. They need this forgiveness program to move forward. And I talked to several banks who have expressed the same thing. They're trying to gear up and work with SBA and restaurants to address this forgiveness. They are warning us that it is going to be burdensome and difficult. So obviously my office is here to help one-on-one with those businesses, but as important, we need to make additional changes. That's why that communication is so important, folks. We need to know the nuance, the granular issues that are taking place as we try to adjust these things and move forward. Let me touch on one more thing and then I'll take your questions. Immigration reform. It is depressing to me that I am now in my 12th year here and we have not passed immigration reform. We did pass a similar measure out of the House under President Obama. The Senate did not take it up. There was a comprehensive immigration law passed out of the Senate, which unfortunately the Republican at the time Speaker of the House refused to put on the floor. So we simply have to get there. And I'm a proud supporter of the DREAM Act, which would prevent deportation and allow the DACA program to be permanent and providing a pathway to citizenship for dreamers in the program. This is all a lot more difficult when we face a crisis with an administration that attempts to exploit it and use, probably from its earliest point, xenophobic, anti-immigration tactics to appeal to, well, I guess, their base. It's sad and it's unfortunate. I'm reminded that at a different time in our nation's history when we faced a crisis and polarization of such extreme measures, that a president appealed to the better angels of our nature instead of appealing to the worst. So we have to step above that, and I'm proud to work with all of you toward that end. I'll be honest, it's hard for me to imagine any measure like this passing under this president, but I have great hopes it will pass within the first 6 months of the next administration. So I look forward to Thanksgiving when we can have a lot to look back at. It will probably be Thanksgiving before we know what happens in the next election. But we can be grateful for all we have, and that hopefully our country will get back to remembering who we are and sharing that with the rest of the world as we work united together to move forward, especially including our immigrant friends.
Thank you, Congressman. And again, thank you for joining us today. We've got a couple of questions for you. And first, I'm going to invite Lacey Chantal to tell a little bit of her story and then go ahead and ask you a question.
Hello, Congressman Quigley. My name is
There you are.
Lacey Chantal. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Congressman Quigley. My name is Lacey Chantal. My spouse and I have been together for 14 years, and we have been married since 2010. We have 6 beautiful children, all of who are U.S. citizens. For the past 7 years, I have worked at the VA home in Quincy, Illinois, the oldest and largest VA home in the state of Illinois. I'm an essential worker who works long hours, making sure my veterans and their spouses are safe, healthy, and happy. I love my job and I love my residents like my own family. Since COVID, I have been working even harder to make sure our residents stay healthy. We have had employees get sick, and as a result, I have had to pick up overtime shifts to ensure the standards of care. I am speaking to you today after working a 12-hour shift from 3 p.m. yesterday to 3 a.m. this morning. I am a U.S. citizen. I work for the government, caring for those who sacrifice for that very same government. We pay our taxes, we work hard. Despite all of this, my family did not receive a stimulus. And the only reason is that my spouse is an immigrant and we file our taxes jointly and he uses an ITIN. This was a huge slap in the face. I am punished because of who I married. We work hard, we pay our taxes. Why am I being treated like a second-class citizen? Now that you know my story, my question for you is this. Do you support inclusion of mixed status families like mine in the next stimulus checks, like the American Coronavirus Relief Act proposed by Senator Marco Rubio, so that all U.S. citizens married to immigrants can get the help we need during this crisis?
Before I answer that, Lacey, I want to thank you personally for your hard work during this difficult time. And my best to your family. I can't imagine this. And someone needs to apologize to you on behalf of our government. And
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry this is happening to you. This shouldn't happen in any country. It's so contrary to who we are supposed to be. But forgetting all that, it's just so grossly unfair. So I'm going to do everything I can. And I guess the other reason I want to thank you for doing this is, you know, when we're here, we get a lot of papers with statistics on it. They're just numbers. They're just pieces of paper. So it helps a lot to talk to you one-on-one and to hear your stories. And it's our intention when we get closer to these measures, if you're willing, that we can talk about your story on the House floor and share with the American people why this mattered. I think we do our best things as a country and Congress when we remember people and why this matters, and that there's, in addition to you and your spouse, 6 little ones in your house that are dependent on such things. So it's the right thing to do as a country and from our heart. It's the right thing to do from our smarts of who we are as a country. Stimulus should be including of everyone. And I read what people were doing with the stimulus, and a lot of them were buying groceries with it. You know, I know the necessities come first. So I'm sorry you're going through this, but I want to thank you for giving me motivation to do even more, to do the best we can And I want you to know I'll be thinking of you when we vote on this on the House floor.
Thank you.
Congressman, this is Joshua Hoyt. To follow up on Ms. Chantal's story, it's not just a story of her, it's a story of over 1 million U.S. families with U.S. citizen spouses, U.S. citizen children, or even those that pay ITIN. This is something that we've picked out as ABIC to be a bipartisan issue. And it's a strong moral high ground issue. For one thing, Ms. Chantal is being punished for who she married. And as Republican Marco Rubio said, what's the solution? She should get a divorce? That's not a solution. It's a Republican marriage penalty. What we'd like to ask of you, you've done a really good job of picking out specific immigration issues, the work that you did on visas for Poles, the inclusion of LGBT spouses in immigration, the ability to legalize. This is an issue like this in your position as in Ways and Means, where families are being penalized because who they're married to or who their parents are. Specifically, it would be helpful if you could communicate to Chairman Neal and to Speaker Pelosi in writing that this is very important to your constituents and you believe in it, that you could do a public statement. But more than that, you are a very creative person who understands how to take something this unfair and lift it up to the general public. You already mentioned one thing you could do, which would be talk about Ms. Chantal's situation on the floor of Congress to personalize this. We don't know how realistic it is that a stimulus will pass, but we're hoping that you will be a very visible, vocal supporter of this particular fix as we go into this next several months. Thank you very much.
Sure. And you mentioned at the end something, it's not fait accompli that the next CARES COVID package has to include a second round of stimulus. So none of this matters unless we have that second round. But then obviously I'll talk to Chairman Neal and Speaker Pelosi about this issue. We'll make a public statement. I'll talk to them personally. We'll send them a letter. I'll make a public statement. And just for clarification, I'm on the Appropriations Committee.
I'm sorry, I meant Appropriations.
Yep. Not Ways and Means, but it's a close cousin. What we say here is that authorizers think they're God and appropriators know they are.
There you go.
It's poor.
Well,
it's poor
your
congressional
powers
humor.
here, please. Thank you.
I'll do whatever I can. You have my commitment to the letter and the statement, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Our next question comes from Scott Grams, the Executive Director of the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association.
I just want to thank you, Lacey, for sharing your story. It just reminds us all why we all fight so hard in our organizations for these issues. So thank you. That was very moving. Congressman Quigley, thank you for being with us today. The House Appropriations Committee and the appropriations process has become essential to guest worker programs since everything else related to immigration, as you noted, is at a standstill. Given the current economic situation and a high unemployment rate, does this finally offer the opportunity to tie the guest worker program caps to the unemployment rate once and for all? As industry groups, we rely on the guest worker programs to support domestic jobs. And oftentimes when the unemployment rate is low, it's very frustrating to be told by lawmakers that we should just go out and find people and that these guest worker programs should not be available. And I imagine it's equally frustrating to you as a lawmaker to be told we can't find workers when the unemployment rate is high. So does this present an opportunity now to tie these guest worker programs to caps that would be related to the national unemployment rate?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very good point. It's harsh to say this, but never waste a crisis. There simply has to be something good that comes from all of this. And you raised just one example of that. So I think we're talking about that in caucus now, the Democratic caucus, and among certain lawmakers. And as we come back, we're back next week in DC to discuss these matters. That will be a high priority as well. And we'll see what we can include it in. There are a lot of individual bills that you may be discussing. The best I think that can happen now is that we bring as many of these measures into the larger COVID care packages to try to get them done before the end of the year. That's their best chance. We're going to do whatever we can to pass them in the short term, but I will tell you it's part of a very intense agenda with, knock on wood, what would be a Biden administration's first 6 months. But it's again, the nuance is going to matter. And as you see what we do, what's going to be important is that you let us know if we're missing something or what to accentuate as we go forward.
All right, Congressman, it looks like we have one more question for you from Mr. Sam Scott.
Congressman, I think you've already addressed part of this, but one of the issues that we're very concerned about is the process of forgiveness is extremely complicated. And a lot of the smaller businesses just don't know how to address it. So we really, really would like to see a much more streamlined forgiveness process, even to the extent that below a certain level of loans, it's automatically forgiven. Can that be? I'm sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say, is that something we can look at if in fact we get to this next phase, the next PPP, and going back to the old one and changing the laws that we have right now to make it more amenable to the people that have been borrowing money? Yeah,
Another great point. And it ought to have bipartisan support, and I think it does. It's making sure it's there. Again, I'm starting to talk to banks, the SBA, want to make sure that the agencies that are going to be involved with it have the resources they need to help everyone that is in need. In addition, first and foremost, I know my colleagues in the Chicago congressional delegation feel the same way. We want to be helpful. Number two, we need to make sure that the agencies have the resources and the banks are focused on doing this right for all of the applicants and all the people who are having issues. And then we need to take all this information and make sure that we incorporate the changes necessary. We tweaked it a little bit before. There's going to be more, especially when we have, because we must have a second round of such programs. And again, I'm also hearing loud and clear, there are businesses saying, I don't need more debt, I need more direct assistance. And that has to be our watchword. Right. So well taken. We want to help individually. Our office is available, but we're going to incorporate this all we can into the next round of bills. And just, I know you will. I've dealt with my friend Josh for a long time. He's just one who stays on things as long as he needs to until they think they get done. But we appreciate, again, everything you've done, and we appreciate your putting this call together.
Thank you, Congressman. We appreciate your time, and I know you've got to run before we go over to the rest of our presentation. So thank you again for spending time with us this morning.
Sure. And as we say, stay close, but 6 feet close. God bless. Bye-bye.
All right, so now we are going to turn things over to Tracy Ward so that we can go through the part of our presentation for small businesses on the PPP forgiveness process. Tracy.
Thanks, James. And I know you're pulling up the presentation. We'll jump right in and try and cover things pretty quickly. I'll talk through what the current rules are. As everyone's been discussing, we really hope that there are some changes coming from Congress to make this all a little bit easier, because right now it is very complicated. But I'll try and go through quickly what the current rules are so that you're getting yourself in at least the best position you can to make sure you can qualify for forgiveness. And then I'll talk through, as we're talking with businesses and PPP borrowers, what some of the issues that we're hearing and questions we're getting. So you can go ahead to the next slide, please, James. Once we kind of cover that, I'll talk through some specific tips that we're seeing. Next slide. So let's jump right in. Under the current rules, there are 3 big things you need to remember if you want to qualify for the maximum amount of forgiveness on your PPP loan. You need to use it for eligible purposes, payroll costs and non-payroll costs. You need to use your funds during your required time period, and you need to maintain your staff. So let's talk about each of these and break them down a little bit. Next slide. Payroll costs, this is essentially the same definition, or should be the same definition as it was when you applied. So we've got a lot of detail on here with some information that SBA has provided since that time. But the big picture thing to remember here is that payroll costs need to be at least 60% of your forgiveness request. So you need to spend at least 60% of your PPP loan towards these eligible payroll costs. And that applies no matter when you got your PPP loan. So the changes that went in place in the Flexibility Act apply to all loans. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about some of the questions we're getting with payroll costs. The main one we're getting is it okay to increase employee pay if you need to pay hazard pay? And yes, that's fine, as long as you're not paying any employee more than $100,000 annualized. So you'll look at your period and you won't go over the amount that you could pay an employee for that period. Big point here, though, is if you are one of the owners of the business, you are not allowed to increase your pay. You have to limit it to the average you made in 2019, and you also are capped at $100,000 a year. We can go ahead to the next slide, please, James. Non-payroll costs. So you can use your entire loan for payroll costs, and that's great. But if you need to, you can use at least 40% of it for these non-payroll costs. Again, there are only 3 categories that count that are eligible. That is interest payments on any mortgages or secured debt. So a loan for the building or a loan for equipment. You can use PPP funds to pay those interest payments. If you're paying rent or lease payments for your business, you can use those with your PPP funds. And utility payments. There's been a big question about what is a transportation utility. This is basically a state or local road maintenance fee. So no other transportation costs would qualify. It really is just if your state or local government's charging you a road use fee or a street maintenance fee. Next slide. So we've talked about what you can use the funds for. When do you need to use these funds? So SBA calls this your covered period. Your covered period starts the day you received your PPP loan funds. So the day that money hit your bank account, that's your day 1. And regardless of when you got your PPP loan, you have up to 24 weeks to use those funds. One tip here is you're not required to wait until the end of that 24-week period to apply for forgiveness. So these funds cover about 2.5 months worth of payroll. You probably will have used these funds up in about 2.5 months. If you have, once you've used them, you could go ahead and apply even though your covered period is a 24-week period. Next slide. So it's important to think about, as you're using your PPP funds, if the cost is something that is due during your covered period, so you pay it during your covered period, that counts. If it's incurred during your covered period, even if the regular due date is not until after the end of your covered period, as long as you pay it by that due date, it counts. The important thing to remember here is SBA has been pretty clear that prepayments do not count. So if your covered period ends mid-October and you have PPP funds that you haven't used, you can't use those to pay your December rent. It's not due yet, it's not incurred yet, so that would not be a forgivable use. Next slide. So the third thing you need to pay attention to is maintain staff. This was really set out to be a program to help you keep staff on payroll, keep paying, and then at the end of this, you would have the benefit of not having to go out and rehire and retrain in order to get back up and running. There are lots of exceptions to this, so we'll talk through those, but in general, you need to maintain each employee's wages, and you need to maintain your total average full-time equivalent number of employees. So these are two independent calculations, and I want to spend some time talking through this because we've gotten so many questions about this particular issue. So let's walk through this example. Say back in January, you had an employee who made $20 an hour and worked 40 hours a week for you on average. Once COVID hit, you had to reduce that employee's hours, but you're still paying that employee $20 an hour when they work for you. So you don't have a wage reduction. You have continued to pay this employee the same hourly wage that you were paying pre-COVID, but you do have a full-time equivalent employee reduction. They were working 40 hours a week, now they're working 20 hours a week. So you've gone down about 1/2 FTE. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about maintaining staff wages. This is based on their average weekly wages for your covered period. You can reduce them a little if you need to, but it's important to keep them to at least 75% of what they were making pre-COVID. Otherwise, it's going to impact your total forgiveness amount. You're going to compare this always with the period of January 1st through March 31st. That's the period that SBA set for this comparison. And you're going to compare average weekly wages during your covered period with that period. Next slide. So let's go through a couple of examples quickly. If you have an hourly employee, in this example, they're paid $20 an hour, but you had to cut their pay to $14 an hour because of COVID. That's a 30% wage reduction. You're allowed up to 25%. So the portion that's over that 25% is $1 an hour. So ultimately, that's going to be an average weekly wage reduction of $10. SBA requires that you multiply that $10 by the total weeks of your covered period. And that amount's going to be reduced from your forgiveness amount. So you really want to avoid a reduction over 25% if you can. If you do have to reduce somebody 25% or more, then you can restore that pay prior to applying for forgiveness. If you bring their hourly wage back up to $20 an hour or whatever it was before you apply, then that would work. You don't have to do back pay to get that exception. Next slide is the same thing, a salary example. If you have a salaried employee, I won't walk through this one, but it sort of helps you figure out how you calculate what that total average weekly wage reduction would be. Next slide, please. So full-time equivalents. You also need to maintain your head count and the total number of hours that they work on average. SBA had not originally provided formulas or explanations of how they wanted you to think about this. So you're not held to the number of employees that you put on your original PPP loan application. You're going to recalculate this when you apply for forgiveness, and you're going to compare your pre-COVID period with your covered period to determine if you've managed to keep the same number of full-time equivalent employees. Next slide. this just tells you sort of the covered periods you can choose from. Of course, you're going to pick the one where you had the fewest pre-COVID fewest employees. Next slide, please, James. And there are exceptions. So you may be unable to rehire employees you've laid off. They're not willing to come back. You may have an employee you have to fire. These are exceptions that SBA allows, and then it won't count against you. You do need to document them. You need to keep written documentation of what happened so that you can show you meet these exceptions. I want to really focus on this last bullet point exception because this one is very broad, and we think this helps a lot of businesses. Even if you can't meet the other exceptions for why you've been unable to bring employees back, if the impact of COVID has prevented your business from operating at the same level of activity that you were able to operate at before COVID, then you are not penalized if you've had to lay off staff. Your forgiveness won't be reduced. You are definitely going to want to keep documentation that for your business location, there were restrictions in place or guidance issued by state or local government or by the CDC that required you to either shut down or required smaller gatherings, something that impacted your business, and you're going to want to keep copies of your financials. But if this applies to you, and we think it should apply pretty broadly to most businesses, then you're not going to be penalized for not bringing employees back when you just didn't have the business to have employees at the time. Next slide, please, James. Really quickly, a couple of tips on timing. Right now, because Congress is actively considering changes that would make forgiveness easier or that might allow broader uses of the funds, we really think it makes the most sense for most borrowers to delay applying for forgiveness. We think changes are likely that would help you get maximum forgiveness. You have 10 months from the end of your covered period to apply for forgiveness. So you're not going to miss that window if you wait another few weeks to see if Congress is able to pass some favorable changes. And your deferral on your PPP loan extends until that forgiveness determination is made by your lender and SBA. So you're not going to have to start making loan payments until that time. Next slide, please. Very quickly, want to highlight EIDL loans, the SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loans. Some of you applied for EIDL loans. They're a really good source of low-cost debt. They're not forgivable, but they are a good long-term, low-cost loan if you need it. They have much broader range of uses. So that is a good resource for your business if you need it, but it is debt. Some of you also applied for and got an SBA EIDL loan advance. This would have been up to $10,000. If you got an EIDL advance, even though all of the public description of EIDL advances from SBA and Treasury has been that EIDL advances are grants that do not have to be repaid, under current law, your PPP loan forgiveness will be reduced by the amount of your EIDL advance, which essentially means you're going to end up repaying your EIDL advance if you also got a PPP loan. That's also something that we're hopeful Congress will address, but right now that's the case. Next slide, please, James. One tip quickly, if you are a business where you are the only employee, the easiest way for you to get forgiveness is to choose the 24-week period, use your entire loan amount to pay your own payroll cost, to pay yourself as the business employee, and you shouldn't be required to have additional documentation for that. Your lender should have collected your 2019 pay documentation when you got the loan, and that's what documents if you're using the whole thing for payroll as a single person business with no employees other than yourself. And then I think the next is probably our last slide before we'll try and jump to Q&A. this just highlights the things that SBA is going to look at when the lender sends in your forgiveness request. It's important to remember SBA can review these loans at any time, whether it's before you request forgiveness or after they've signed off on the forgiveness amount. And when they do the review, they'll look at eligibility, they'll look at loan amount, how you use the money, they'll look at your forgiveness amount, and they can come back and question any of that. So keep your records, keep your documentation. That just protects you. You've done your best to use these funds the way you're supposed to. And we just want to make sure that you actually are able to get fully forgiven so that you don't have to have debt from this program that was intended to be grant funding to keep your business going. With that, I'll turn it over for Q&A, and hopefully we can address some of your other questions.
Great, thank you, Tracy. That's very helpful as always. So I've got a couple of questions, and really quickly, I wanted to let everybody know if you have a question come up, please send a private message in the chat to me, and we'll get through as many as possible, but I'll just go ahead and get started with what we've got so far. Is garbage collection included in utility costs?
It's a good question. I've heard differing things from different advocates I've heard different opinions. I have not seen a clear answer from SBA. So right now I would assume no, but I do think it's an open question. So SBA may provide more clarity on that in the coming days.
Okay. This is someone's situation. What if my staff size goes down, but only because some of my staff didn't want to come back and I couldn't find a new hire to take their place? Will that affect forgiveness?
If you document that, that should not reduce your forgiveness amount. So if you've had employees that you had to lay off and you've offered to bring them back and they say no, they don't want to come back, that is an exception. If you have open positions and you try to fill those positions and you can't find a similarly qualified employee to hire, that is an exception. So document that, document the job search, document your rehire offer. Just make sure you keep a record of this. SBA is also asking and requiring that if you have laid off an employee, you make a good faith offer and they refuse to come back, that you notify the state unemployment office. SBA has said they will provide a method so that businesses know how to do that. That's still outstanding. We haven't seen their method yet, but you're going to want to just keep all your records so that you can show that's the case, and then it should not reduce your forgiveness.
Great. Would interest or other debt service costs related to maintenance of commercial property be eligible?
Not related to maintenance. So the only interest that is allowed that you can use your PPP loan funds for and be forgiven is if you have interest on a business mortgage. So your business owns its building and you're paying a mortgage loan to a bank, the interest portion you can use towards forgiveness. If you have an equipment loan, really any secured debt of your business. So if you have to finance equipment or vehicles for your business, that debt payment, the interest portion, you can count towards PPP, but otherwise, other loans of the business, you can't deduct the interest as PPP.
Sure. I own a farm and use a lot of seasonal employees. How does this change my forgiveness calculation when it comes to full-time employees?
So SBA has provided, you can choose the period from 2019 that most closely matches your covered period. They give you a time period between basically mid-May of 2019 and mid-September, and you can choose the 12-week period that is your closest match to your covered period. So the idea being during the same time period for your seasonal business, you would have been expected to have the same number of employees. So you'll want to look at that. They do have seasonal rules and time periods that you can use. Again, if your farm business has not been able to return to full operations or normal operations because of COVID-related restrictions or guidance, then you are not penalized for reducing your number of employees. It wouldn't impact your forgiveness. So you can keep copies of the guidance for your location, keep copies of your financials to show that you haven't been able to operate at the same levels, and that should also take care of that for you.
Sure. Our next question, would a restaurant qualify to be under safe harbor due to a 25% capacity restriction?
For this exception on FTEs, that you aren't penalized for fewer FTEs if COVID-19 has impacted your business activity. Yes, I would say our understanding is that this is fairly broad. As a restaurant, if you have to operate with 25% reduction in capacity, as you were pointing out at the beginning of this session, restaurants have pretty thin margins, and you're not intended to operate at less than full capacity and be successful. And so keep copies of your financials that show the impact on your business, and keep copies of that guidance for your location that you had to reduce your capacity, that was due to state, local, or federal guidance, and that should satisfy that exception for SBA.
Does the EIDL does receiving an EIDL change my PPP forgiveness chances or calculation?
So in general, no. If you got an EIDL, an EIDL loan, and remember there are two separate, there's an EIDL loan, and some people also got an EIDL loan advance. So let's talk about them separately. The EIDL loan really has no impact on your PPP loan. At the time you got your PPP loan, you could potentially have refinanced your EIDL loan into your PPP loan. If most people didn't, we frankly did not think that made business sense for borrowers, but you could. If you did not refinance your EIDL with your PPP loan, then the only real thing to remember is that you should be using your EIDL for something other than payroll costs. We're allowed to have PPP and EIDL and use them both for payroll. So EIDL has more broader uses. You would want to use it, you could use it for inventory, you could use it to buy masks or shields or other things, and then use the PPP for payroll. But they really don't impact or affect your forgiveness chances at all if you got an EIDL loan. If you also received an EIDL loan advance, that will impact your forgiveness. Under the current law, SBA will reduce your PPP forgiveness amount by the amount of the advance. You would have gotten an advance anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 if you got that. So we think that is not what businesses need right now. This money, EIDL advances, were promised to be grants. They were promoted by the government to be grants. And now telling businesses, sorry, you have to repay that portion, seems like a really bad idea and really harsh on businesses that needed and used that money to stay open or to keep surviving. So we're hopeful that there will be a change to that. I would encourage you, just like Lacey shared her story, and as Representative Quigley pointed out, hearing from you directly, hearing from real small business owners that are struggling to get through this crisis and are trying to keep your business going and trying to keep your staff paid, hearing your stories directly can be really powerful. And right now, as they're working on trying to figure out what changes can be made or should be made, it's really important to reach out and just let your voices be heard so that they have real stories about how this is impacting businesses.
All right, I know we're running against the clock, but I've gotten this question a couple of times in the chat, so I really want to make sure we get to it. if all the PPP loans are used as they are supposed to, used effectively and within the law, but subsequently my business closes or has to shut down, will that impact forgiveness?
No. We've gotten lots of questions about this. So if you use those funds the way you were required to under the PPP program, and you get through your covered period, then you're fine. If you subsequently have to shut down, it does not impact your forgiveness. If you are using those funds as you're supposed to, or you've used them as you're supposed to, and your business shuts down even before the end of your covered period, you know, those funds were about 2.5 months worth of payroll. That's not solving everything, and it's not even solving payroll longer than 2.5 months. So you may have used them correctly and still have to shut down even before your covered period is over, before you apply for forgiveness. In that case, you meet this broad exception that COVID-19, the restrictions have impacted your business, and you aren't able to keep operating at your activity. So you would still qualify for forgiveness. You shouldn't have a reduction because of that. Unfortunately, I do think this help was great and was much needed, but it didn't solve for everything. And some businesses are still going to face that decision. I hope as few as possible, but you would still be eligible for forgiveness if that happened.
Great, thank you, Tracy, and thank you for sharing your expertise. We'll go ahead and wrap up here. We will be sharing Tracy's PowerPoint, her slides with everybody, and we will also get to work on some more concrete examples on how forgiveness works so that there's a better guide for people. But before we go, I'd like to ask everyone on the call to please contact our congresspeople for a PPP extension, for a streamlined forgiveness process, and for stimulus checks for mixed status families like Lacey's family, who we heard from earlier. So please don't be shy about that. Contact your elected officials and let them know that this is important to you. But thank you, everybody, for coming. We appreciate your time, and we will be following up with a recording of this webinar and Tracy's slides from her portion of the presentation. Thank you, everybody.